today we're talking, the subject of today's talk is demystifying Kundalini. So I am very excited to talk about this today. It's actually a subject that I know so much about, and it's wild that I almost never talk about it. I've been talking about spirituality on the internet for almost 3 years, and I've probably mentioned the word Kundalini a handful of times, right? And I think that this is because it's a subject that is incredibly misrepresented and kind of wrought with confusion throughout this online spiritual world and just spirituality in general, to such a degree that I felt like I don't even have time to go into it, honestly. So I'm happy to be here today to attempt to demystify Kundalini in half an hour. Okay. As always, I'm speaking from the perspective of my spiritual tradition, hey Casey, which is classical tantra or Mahashakti yoga. I'll be talking about how Kundalini, Shakti, Prana, and grace, anugraha, are actually synonyms in a moment. But you could also say that I practice Mahakundalini yoga. My tradition is irrefutably a Kundalini tradition, okay? But the thing is, any tradition that is geared around grace, anugraha, the power of revealment, is a Kundalini tradition, because this power is the power of spiritual awakening and spiritual knowledge. So I've been working with Kundalini in her many manifestations for 8 years, so I know a lot about it, and I've seen a lot of shit, and I've heard a lot of shit, okay? So I'm happy to be here today to do my best to talk about this in just half an hour, all right? So let's go over the basic ideas. It's a fairly common concept in the yogic traditions that Kundalini must be awake in the body for God realization to occur. God realization is when the ego identifies with its source consciousness rather than just with itself in the limited sense. So really, Kundalini is the heart of all spiritual operations. There's no realization without Kundalini awakening, period, full stop. That's kind of an irrefutable truth in my tradition and among other traditions. Another thing to understand is that Kundalini is God. Kundalini is a revealed form of God that can be somatically felt in the body and experienced in the mind. Kundalini is the goddess, so you could also refer to her literally as goddess Kundalini. People often talk about Kundalini as if it's just like this object or something. They talk about Kundalini as if it's just this occurrence in the subtle body. It's this thing that we're trying to force as if it's an object, okay? It's the sleeping snake in the base of the spine that wakes up and causes all sorts of experiences, right? That's a metaphor. That occurrence within the subtle body is God. It's a revealed form of God, thus its grace, that has become awake in the body to do something. She's doing her work upon us to purify us so that we may come into deeper awareness of her, okay? Deeper awareness of God. That's the point of Kundalini awakening. Another name for goddess Kundalini is Mahakundalini, Supreme Kundalini, and she is the source, substance, and consummation of everything. So, I don't know if that sounds familiar, but the Divine Mother and goddess Kundalini are also synonymous, okay? Basically, all we need to understand is that Kundalini is God. All right, we can forget all of this stuff about it being this object that wakes up in our body, all right? Kundalini is God. Kundalini is the power of consciousness. And we need to understand that in order to understand what she is doing in the body. Yes, she is at work in the body. And she is also at work as everything because she is the power of everything, okay? This is just a micro version of the macro thing that's happening in our bodies. So more synonyms, okay? Kundalini, Prana, and grace are synonymous. And this might be confusing, but it's actually quite simple. I also refer to the movement of Kundalini in the body as Shakti, the movement of Shakti. All of these things are synonymous. It can get really confusing with all of these terms, but I promise you this actually makes sense. Kundalini and grace are synonyms. Grace, if you've been in my space for any amount of time, you already know this, but grace is the power of revealment. It's the force of awakening at work in the world, whose only job it is to bring you closer to awareness of God, to awareness of the all-permeating nature of God, okay? Grace is the force of awakening. Sound familiar? Kundalini is the same exact thing. The force of awakening in the body, okay? The only difference is that we tend to use the word Kundalini to describe only her movements in the body. But if Kundalini is actually the goddess, her movements are also everything as well. Kundalini awoke in the body of the universe to give rise to form as part of her own spiritual path that she is on. God's on a spiritual path. You can think of it like that. Kundalini is also prana. Maybe we've heard of this before. Prana is vital life force. It's like the power that's keeping us alive. So if you don't have prana working in the body, you are dead. You die. When you die, prana leaves the body, right? So if Kundalini and prana are synonyms, if you don't have Kundalini working in the body, you die too. So logically, this means that Kundalini is active in everyone, whether they know it or not. Kundalini is at work on some level in you right now, okay? That's what's happening right now. The spiritual process really begins, however, when she's not just keeping the body alive in the form of just basic prana, but when she awakens in the body and begins the work of purifying the mind so that she may return to her source within us, which is at the crown of the head. That's Kundalini who has awakened, okay? Kundalini is the power of consciousness, as opposed to the witnessing passive aspect of consciousness that is Lord Shiva, who's the masculine aspect. Prana, the vital life force, is kind of understood as her cosmic energy, okay? Her movement. Another word for Kundalini awakening that's traditional in the yogic traditions is pranotana, which means the release of prana. So it's the release of her cosmic energy in the body for the sake of her return to her source, okay? There are actually two primary emanations of Kundalini that can unfold in the mind and the body. So there's Chit Kundalini and there's Prana Kundalini. Chit Kundalini is active in the paths of self-inquiry, or the paths that are very contemplative and inwardly focused. A good example of this is Zen Buddhism. Anyone who has been enlightened in the Zen tradition has Chit Kundalini to thank, whether they know it or not. Chit Kundalini moves silently through the system and actually bypasses all of the chakras and nadis by jumping from the base to the crown of the head, which grants mukti, liberation, okay? Prana Kundalini is active in the paths of ecstasy and devotion. It's a much more dynamic energy that can be felt somatically in the body and experienced quite viscerally in the mind. In Sufism, they refer to this sort of active force of awakening as baraka. In the yogic traditions, you call this kriya, action, movement, okay? Prana Kundalini ascends through all of the nadis and the chakras to clear the way for her ascent to the crown of the head. This is what she's doing. This also, Prana Kundalini does this as well, and this also grants mukti, liberation. But Prana Kundalini actually rests in the heart after accomplishing her work in the crown of the head, and this grants bhukti, which means bliss, okay? So there's an idea that Chit Kundalini leads to realization and leads to liberation, but Prana Kundalini leads to blissful liberation because she ultimately emanates and is expressed through the heart center. So the Prana Kundalini traditions lead to this really embodied, ecstatic, love-oriented realization of God, okay? So before you get overwhelmed, these are details that none of us need to be wringing our fingers over. Like, am I doing Prana Kundalini or Chit Kundalini? Oh my God. But the reason why I bring it up is because people have been led to believe that Kundalini is only active in the awakening sense if it's emanating as Prana Kundalini, okay? When in reality, Chit Kundalini and Prana Kundalini can be active at the same time. Or Chit Kundalini can just be active. So we don't need these huge Kundalini experiences that we've all been told about to realize that all of this is God. But she does need to be active in the system in order for that to happen at all, okay? We've gotten into a trap where we think we need to have some sort of a massive spiritual experience to validate our spiritual development, when that actually isn't true at all, okay? This whole thing of Chit and Prana Kundalini you'll never see online or anything. This is from tantric books that my teacher has elucidated. We've gone into a trap where we think we need to have some sort of massive spiritual experience to validate our spiritual development, when that's actually not true at all. Kundalini must be working in the mind and body in order for God realization to occur. But the way that this unfolds can be incredibly subtle, okay? It can absolutely be Chit Kundalini, and that's the only thing that's going on with you, and that is absolutely enough to accomplish the goal of the human incarnation. Intense, ecstatic spiritual experiences are absolutely valuable, okay? In the sense that they can humble us and build our faith in the process that we're in. Think of it like that. However, they can also become detriments to us, because we might become the sort of spiritual aspirants who only chase those sorts of experiences and those sorts of states. We think the experiences are the thing that's going to help us, when in reality, the thing that helps us is to get more interested in what these experiences actually are and how we can become participants in them. We aren't chasing experiences. We're trying to come into deeper awareness of what is appearing in the form of our experiences. Kundalini is not an object, she is God. Okay? And ultimately, what needs to happen is that we need to allow ourselves, we become participants in this when we get out of the way, so that we can be experienced by the source of experience. Okay, this sounds esoteric, but this is how it's feeling, okay? This is why I'm always talking about surrender. You cannot be a Kundalini yogi without also becoming a master of surrender. Because this awakening energy is trying tirelessly to do her work upon us. And the only thing getting in the way is our own egos and our beliefs about how we think things should be going. We want to get out of the way so she can do what needs to be done to clear our vision. This is very important. What a real Kundalini yogi does is surrender to the intelligence of this power to the point that they are not even doing anything. They are not chasing anything. They are in the disposition of being worked by her intelligent power. Here's something that people need to understand. We as individuals don't actually make anything happen spiritually. We as individuals don't make God realization happen. We don't make the heart open, okay? All we do is put ourselves into a disposition in which this purifying power can do its work upon us and surrender to this internal process that is eternally unfolding. You don't go and find it. You surrender to the fact that it's already here. You don't go and find it. You surrender to the fact that it's already here. This is very subtle. What seems like an outside force in our lives as we tread the spiritual path, what seems like an outside force that leads to our awakening on the spiritual path, is false. There's no outside source causing your spiritual awakening. All transformation is an inside job. This is what we need to understand with Kundalini. It's the power of awakening working from within to clear the way towards deeper understanding. Okay? It's important to understand that the movement of Kundalini is actually a purification. It's a purification. She moves at the gross, subtle, and causal levels of being. These are three things that come up all the time in the yogic traditions. We have three aspects of being as humans. The gross aspect, or the dense aspect, is the body. The subtle aspect is the mind and the chakras and the nadis. And the causal level is a bit more abstract. It's the aspect of our being that's more in tune with our source, which is consciousness. When Kundalini moves in dynamic ways in the gross body, that's when we see big manifestations in the body and the mind, when we think of typical Kundalini awakening experiences. Something interesting that I've literally never heard anyone talk about outside of my tradition is that these big Kundalini experiences are actually indicative of the urgent need for purification. And the big experiences are actually her most dense manifestation in the body, the grossest manifestation in the body. It's the most rudimentary version of what Kundalini does in the mind and the body. And yet people think this is what we need to be constantly chasing. Isn't that interesting? Because as Kundalini continues to purify the subtle body, these experiences actually become more and more subtle, more and more internal, more and more psychological, and more meditative. So having more and more big experiences is paradoxically not indicative of greater spiritual development. No one is saying this, but this is true. She's stuck in the gross aspect of being and in the body. And when we become more spiritually developed, she works in the more subtle aspect, not just the gross aspect. Now consider that next time you meet a bliss junkie, okay? They're totally doing it wrong, okay? The last thing, the last thing I'd like to say before I open up questions is about the emotional aspect of Kundalini purification. Kundalini purification. I only have half an hour, so I'm sure there's myriad blind spots in my explanation here. But I should have said this in the beginning, but what is Kundalini even doing when she wakes up in the body in the first place? This is something obviously I need to address, okay? She is awake in the body. She is awake in the body to clean it up. The body and the mind. She is awake in the body and the mind to clean it up. So here's a metaphor. We're going to imagine that Kundalini is like our mom, but like the nicest mom we can imagine, like maybe the mom we didn't have, but she's just like the purest, most like amazing, unconditional love mom, okay? And she's just looking after us, and we are her children. And every day, she goes through the house of our body, okay, and cleans it up before the kids wake up. She dusts, she picks up all the toys, she folds all of the clothes and puts them in the hamper. She does this whether we know it or not, okay? And she does it unconditionally and tirelessly until the day that we die, okay? We are participants in this house, though. We live in the house, too. So what we do most of the time, until we become aware of this and become more conscious, is basically undo all of the cleaning that she is relentlessly and thanklessly doing for us. We throw the toys out of the bin, we spill the laundry on the floor, we do all this sort of stuff, right? This is unconscious action. We all do it until we become more conscious. The way that we become participants in our awakening that she is tirelessly working to lead us to is to stop making more messes for her to clean up. Okay? The way we do this is the same way that you court grace, if you understand how grace works. Remember, Kundalini and grace are synonymous? You soak the senses in the nectar of devotion. You do selfless service. You do devotional work. You live consciously and compassionately. You have to live in ways that support the process that you are in, the Kundalini process. What she is doing when she's cleaning is clearing the way for her own ascent through the subtle body. This ascent can be felt in the body. This is the common understanding, right? So we've naturally begun to believe that awakening is correlated to the body, actually. But that's not true. That's her cleaning the gross aspect, the dense aspect of being. Remember, gross, subtle, and causal? What she's actually trying to do is purify and clean the mental aspect, the subtle aspect. Why is that? Because we need to clean up our vision so that we can see that all of this is God. Boom. You don't see that all of this is God through the body. I'm sorry. You don't. You see it through the mind. You see it through the mind. So the more subtle manifestations of Kundalini purification can actually come about in the form of our emotions. She brings to the surface what needs to be purified and cleared out so you can see more clearly. This is logical. So sometimes in the spiritual process, certain things come to the surface emotionally. You might start having really strong emotions that you're not used to, like anger or sadness. Or this is actually a really classical spiritual process manifestation. Memories from earlier times in our life, or memories from childhood. This happened to me a lot a few years ago. The mark of Kundalini purifying a memory is that it's just kind of like totally random. It like there's no explanation. It's like this thought just like randomly comes into the mind. You get a sudden flash of the train station near the house that you grew up in or something, or you imagine this girl who was in your chemistry class in the 10th grade and you're like, I haven't thought about this person in 15 years. When it's really random like that, often if you're in the spiritual process, that's a purification. We don't have to understand what's being purified. We can just recognize, Daima, thank you for this purification, right? We don't have to understand why. Now, this whole thing with Kundalini purifying the mind is why working with an adequate guide is beneficial in the spiritual process, because these emotional purifications absolutely cause people to abandon the spiritual path. All of the great yogis knew this. If you read old yoga manuals, they say all of this. People start meditating, feelings come forward, the release of prana happens, and they're like, I don't like yoga anymore. This is why there's lineages. This is why there's the teacher-student relationship, right? Because we need to speak with people who have experienced what it is that we are experiencing. And that is truly what my role has become. I'm simply someone who is a few steps ahead of you. And because of that, I help you to get to where I am. It's literally that simple. But without this guidance, these movements and purifications can be scary and confusing. So we need someone with some discernment who can help us to piece all of these things together, right? That's literally my job. That's why I'm here, okay? I had this with my own teacher. I would not be here without this. I am indebted to this process, okay? So the spiritual process, I'm like out of breath. The name of my page, the entire thing I'm always talking about, is also a synonym for Kundalini, okay? The spiritual process is the movement of Kundalini in the mind and the body. There are certain processes that are typical of this movement. There are classic spiritual processes, okay? I'm very well versed in these things, and this is why I help people. So, I'm here to talk about, this is what I'm doing in my mentorship work and in my 5-month program that I'm enrolling for. So if you're interested in receiving guidance spiritually, DM me and we can talk about it. It is exactly half an hour right now. I'm so proud of myself. I love it when I nail it like this. Before we skedaddle, does anyone have a question about Kundalini? I will probably rarely answer candid Kundalini questions like this again. I'm going to be honest. So if anyone has a question about an experience they've had, or just a misconception you might have about what this is, or things that you've heard that are counter to what I'm saying, I am happy to answer questions right now. But this may be like one of the last times that I open up discussion like this publicly. So just so you know, because it's a really complicated thing that requires relationship to really understand. But if anyone has a question, I'm happy to answer. Why do Kundalini people feel like a cult? It's probably because of Kundalini Yoga, which is kind of a cult. So there's your answer. Like the, what's his name? The Yogi team guy. Kundalini Yoga so for instance, okay. I said my tradition is Mahashakti Yoga, and I said a synonym of that could be Mahakundalini Yoga. I am not practicing Kundalini Yoga, which is a separate thing, okay? That's like the Sikh yoga forcing Kundalini awake thing, okay? So that's a whole tradition in and of itself. That's why it seems like a cult, because it is, okay? Is a Kundalini experience specifically where you feeling energy sort of rush through all the chakras, like from the pelvis to the crown, or our Kundalini experience is a spectrum to describe a range of spiritual breakthroughs? So what you described is a spiritual process. It's an example of how Kundalini purifies the body. And there is a full spectrum of how she works. And often those sorts of experiences are happening at the grossest aspect of being. And what really happens is over time, when you become a participant in this process, those experiences happen less and less, and the spiritual experiences become more and more internal. So there's less of the sort of ecstatic thing going on. So usually that's a downer for people, but I'm like, I don't make the fucking rules. My higher self understands everything, and anything can feel like a cult, so just like you're wrong. I mean, America's a cult. How to stay grounded during this process? Great question. Guess what I'm gonna say? Surround yourself with the saints. Okay, I'll look at your question, Justin. How to stay grounded during this process? My number one advice for somebody who is in a spiritual emergency is to rely on the stabilizing influences of the saints. This is not what anyone ever wants to hear, but I'm telling you, this fucking works, okay? Listen to satsang. If you don't like all these spiritual saints from India, just listen to a bunch of Ram Dass talks. I'm serious. The role of the guru is to stabilize the awakening of Kundalini in the body. And so the guru, talk about synonyms, the guru is a synonym for grace. The guru is the power of revealment. And what the guru can do in the teacher-student relationship is stabilize this energy so it's not completely destabilizing, okay? That's also what lineage offers. A lineage is a stabilizing influence so that these things can unfold peacefully, okay? Otherwise, it's like you're surging electricity through a poorly wired house. You want your house to be wired well, okay? And so, literally, the saints, listen to satsang, find Anandamaima, just literally Anandamaima. Kundalini is synonymous with grace, yes. Because it's the force of awakening that's at work in the world, grace. But Kundalini, we have reduced it to an object, so we think that it's just this one thing that's happening, when really, Kundalini is Goddess Kundalini, so she is everything. And she has more subtle aspects and more dense aspects, in the same way that God went from subtlety to density to create the universe. Kundalini awoke in her own experience to create the universe. So there's like this macro-micro thing going on. And so Kundalini and grace are synonyms, because grace is the power of revealment, and what Kundalini is doing in the body is trying to reveal God to us in our experience. Yes. Can gross movement of Kundalini burn out your meridians temporarily? Yeah, totally. Damien Eccles talked about that. That can totally be a thing, and it's not like the end of the world. So grace is synonymous with God, the divine. Yeah, because it's the fifth function of God. So God is generator, operator, destroyer, self-concealer, self-revealer. These are the 5 functions of God that are going on at any given moment. And grace is the 5th function, which is interwoven with all of these other functions. That's like how the universe is happening. And so grace is synonymous with God and the divine. I hope you can listen to this again, because it's a lot, but I promise you all of these things add up, I swear. So let me look at the question box. Can you confirm, is the chit considered more subtle, working with subtle energies? Yeah, so chit Kundalini is like an intellectual process. So it is based in the mind. So it's based in that more subtle aspect. Yeah. It's really like the paths of self-inquiry. Jnana Yoga, the path of self-inquiry, that's Chit Kundalini. Zen Buddhism, even like, any realization that happened in kind of like the Gnostic Christian traditions, you could call Chit Kundalini. Even ceremonial magic, because there's not really a big emphasis on ecstasy and devotion in those traditions, because the reason why Prana Kundalini leads to mukti and bhukti, which is bliss and liberation, is because of this kind of heart-centered and devotional aspect. So that's kind of one of the things that changes it. And then you also said, what's up with the bliss junkie perspective seemingly being dominant? It's because there's no actual grounded, evidence-based, lineage-based understanding of how this process is trying to work in the body. And so what I have told you today is not anything that I have made up. I'm literally regurgitating the wisdom of the lineage that I'm a part of, that has had efficacious results for thousands of years. Okay, so like, this is just what's going on. And that's the thing that's so annoying about me, is that I'm always like, yeah, this is what the lineage says. There's a fucking reason why. It's like we need to have these coherent systems where all the pieces add up. Can you imagine? Yeah, that's what I was referring to in his talk. So he's also talking about Kundalini, putting it all together. Yes, so knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel is when Shakti awakes in the body. Same thing. Does anyone else have any other questions? It's fun, talking about that. It's really fun. It's really like, if you really want to be a participant in this process, you gotta understand grace. You gotta understand grace. So if you don't understand grace, I sell my audio of it for $25 on my website, and it's a 3-hour talk, and I promise you, this stuff will start making more sense. And if you don't have $25, DM me and you can listen to it for free. I literally don't care. I just want you to understand this, okay? So that's what's happening, friends. I love that you're here, okay? Is there one more thing? Does anyone have one more thing? Is there something I missed? Did I miss anything? Yeah. Like, you could Google Chit Kundalini and Prana Kundalini, you're not going to find anything. I'm not, like, trying to be like, this is really obscure, but I'm just telling you, like, this is kind of, like, secret information. Oh, yeah, at the end of the grace talk, I talk about, because grace is the power of abundance, actually. So anyone who has ever manifested something, anyone who has ever done a prosperity working in magic, is working with the power of grace, actually. And so it's actually a spiritual process in and of itself to be in right relationship with the power of abundance, because on one level, something happens when people have shakti working in their lives, when people have grace working in their lives. All of the things that they ever wanted start to come to pass. All of the stuff starts happening. Damien Eccles also talks about this. If you meet a magician and their life isn't getting better, they're not doing anything. When you start working with grace and shakti, things start happening for you. You meet the partner you've always wanted. Or maybe you get the job that you've always wanted. Maybe things really start happening for you. And that's a spiritual process in and of itself, because it's a test. Are you going to just move towards the fruit of your practice? Are you just going to move towards the gifts that you've been given and forget about the source of the gift? Or are you going to dig deeper into your practice and thank God for these gifts that you've been given and allow that to be the grist of the mill of your liberation? Because there's plenty of people that just start getting whatever they want and all of a sudden they forget about spirituality. The prasad can become poison, but the poison can also become prasad. So this is really actually an entire part of the spiritual process, is getting in a right relationship with the power of abundance. So, is that the last thing? This has been really long. It's been longer than it was supposed to be. So, I think I'm going to go. If anyone wants to DM me, if anyone who's in here right now is ever having a spiritual emergency, please DM me, I will help you. I know what to do, okay? You will be okay. I'm happy to talk to you. And then other than that, if you're interested in working with me, DM me, we can talk about that too, because that's why I'm here. So, I appreciate all of you, and I will talk to you in some other way, and I'll be back tomorrow. I'm talking again tomorrow. So, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everyone.